Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's World. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Grant Brenner. Welcome to Arash's World.
Hey, hey, Arash. Well, welcome to my world.
Wonderful. Yeah. So, actually, I want to start off with that. How would you describe your world? So, what comes in mind? How would you briefly describe yourself for our audience here?
Oh, well, for me, having a sense of wonder, about things, that's sort of my earliest memory. So I really want people to think about curiosity and about things in the compassion range as well. Really a positive sense of wonder about the mind, the world, people, the sort of the best possible things, nature.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that, Dr. Brenner. So, you have a book called Making Your Crazy Work for You: From Trauma and Isolation to Self-Acceptance and Love. You had me at crazy, actually.
Mm.
So, I find that fascinating because I know some psychologists and psychiatrists are kind of like wary of using that term, but here you have your book, and let's talk about that. What's your approach to that? What do you mean here by crazy, and how can it work for you?
Well, I have to say, on a certain level, some part of me that, psychiatrist in me that doesn't want to stigmatize is very offended that we use the word crazy. And it wasn't without internal conflict. But I think at the end of the day, for me, being crazy is a good thing in the sense of being crazy about something. I'm crazy about this hike. I'm crazy about this person. I'm crazy about this idea. And so I actually would rather kind of reclaim it as a good thing. Though I think the Greek word craze means fractured. I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with having parts or pieces, as long as they fit together well. And for human personality, I think that means in a dynamic way over time. So I truly believe that if we get to know the different parts of ourselves, even sometimes the things that we're not that, cool with, it can really enrich our lives for many of us.
And I
But
think
particularly for people who, yeah, sorry, go ahead. We'll come back to
No, I
whatever I
think
was going to
it's
say.
also like crazy. It depends. I mean, the same as weird. There is like the good kind of weird, the good kind of crazy, and the one that we don't see as good. So I think that that's kind of also interesting how we perceive those terms, and how we feel comfortable with one type of crazy, but not so much with another type.
Right. The other type of crazy is, well, it can mean mentally ill, and it can mean out of touch with reality, right? And it certainly can be used in a derogatory term. The word weird is a word that people have used to describe me since as long as I could remember. And it wasn't always used in a way that made me feel good,
Mhm.
honestly. I don't know what that's been like for you.
Mm. I try to encourage that. I see it as a compliment. I'm doing something right, so it's being weird. But again, not in the sense of creepy. I think that's where I would draw the line personally. But I think like crazy is also the new normal nowadays. When we look around the world, it seems like everything seems out of whack nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why sense of humor. And so we were meeting with our publisher and our book agent. We were meeting after our second book came out, our being me, my co-author, Dr. Mark Borg, and our co-author, Danny Berry, who's a nurse and a mental health degree holder. Our second book is called Relationship Sanity, which is for couples, and our irrelationship. That's our core concept is irrelationship, which is a dysfunctional relationship defined by virtue of using the appearance of trying to have a healthy, close relationship. The performance is used to defend against deeper fears of intimacy, usually related to trauma. And like you said, the world is crazy. Like everything is up in the air. Like we're hitting the singularity. Raymond Kurzweil.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
do you think about that? We're just at
But we're there.
that wave
We're,
is
we're past
cresting.
it. Yeah.
We're surfing on that wave now.
And I think it's like when you talk about trauma, there's this collective trauma that we went through with the pandemic. There's also the personal trauma, and I see it as something that everyone goes through. Of course, some people to a higher degree than others because of the experiences, but we all have a certain sense of trauma, and that is not necessarily a bad thing if we can kind of deal with it, learn from it, overcome it. So I'm glad you think from trauma. So it's kind of like a journey, trauma and isolation, to then accepting yourself the way you are, and even further love and growth and transcendence to a certain extent.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think the sense of love is kind of, it's discussed a lot, obviously, in self-help. It's discussed a lot in different philosophical, religious, and cultural traditions. But in this collective sense, really, where at this time in history, it's very obvious that we're all on the same tiny ball together, right?
Yeah.
And even something like in New York, we had the wildfire smoke coming in from Canada, and I'm a photographer, so I've taken some photos of the sky. Everyone uses the term post-apocalyptic, but I think it might, and I don't mean this in a frightening way, I think it might be more accurate to call it pre-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
And I think if we don't make our crazy work for us, it's going to be bad, as they say in Ghostbusters.
Yeah, and that is again also the new normal, which is quite frightening. And so we spend a lot of our time at work, and so the importance of mental health is something that we are kind of more openly talking about. But you also talk about managers and the importance of again them helping us to boost mental health, to have support, and so on. So, what are some tips you would give about the workplace, both as an employee as well as the employer?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I was contacted by a business guy named Santor Nishizaki, and he's working with an aerospace engineer, James Del Nueve, and a group psychologist, individual psychologist coach, Marcia Chinichian. I had written something about cancel culture, and Santor reached out to me. He said, we're doing research on Gen Z in the workplace. And one of the things, to answer your question, that we really got into is my attachment to the workplace. Attachment style is really talked about a lot in relationships, families, romantic, with friends, but there's actually ways of studying the attachment to the workplace. And I think this kind of work-life balance idea, we really need to kind of expand and deepen, because it's key to that other question. So I think you think about your attachment to your workplace, it's also developmental. People, 20 years ago, you finished college, 30 years ago, you were prepared for the workplace to some extent. I think nowadays it's basically all bets are off. And then there's a ton of other generational issues on top of it. So I think I think we're sort of re-evolving just what work means. And it keeps track with the way identity is shifting and families have changed. Yeah. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. And so when you talk about like early relationships, how that affects who we choose as a partner, how that affects our work, how we perceive our work. And one realization I had, thanks to psychoanalysis, was the moment when I realized that my boss was not my parent, was not my mother. And it was like this sense of relief. And suddenly it's like her criticism does not affect me as much. And so it's once you realize that you're not as driven. And also personally, just today I bought some tortillas for my wife because she couldn't make it. And I think I got the wrong one. And that kind of fear is like, oh no, this is the end of the world. I got the wrong pack of tortillas. It's probably too much. But that goes back to early childhood, where you get the wrong thing and your parents explode at you. But then once I dealt with that feeling, it's like, yeah, who cares, if it's the wrong pack of tortillas. It might have been the correct one, but
Yeah.
that's the thing, though, that we're often not aware of that. So it's like this like programming that is happening in the background that we don't see, and unless we do something about it and bring it into the conscious, we just are driven by it and suffer from it actually as well.
Yeah. I like to think that I'm not alone in this fear of making a mistake at home. Though, one's wife might also just actually be angry. It doesn't mean it's because of how her dad treated her every time.
Yeah.
But this idea in psychoanalysis, right? I'm sure it's called transference. And the whole way psychoanalysis is supposed to work, for people who aren't familiar with it, is you develop like a sickness or a craziness toward your analyst, basically, which is called a transference neurosis. And then you reflect on that and work through it within the analysis. And that allows you to work through these developmental childhood problems outside. And like you said, you have these recognitions, and then overall, maybe some changes in the organization of one's personality, so that things don't feel in these repetitive negative ways, which, right, that's a definition of crazy, is doing the same thing over and over again.
Yes, absolutely. And so that feeling also of like when we choose wisely in terms of work, like what we really like to do. And I see a lot of people who are not enjoying what they're doing. And I'm thinking like there is an easy solution, just find something that you like. And I think our generation, my generation, Generation X, was been like we kind of rebelled against that, and now I think we've set the way and opened the path for the younger ones now to, and it's okay to choose what you like. You don't have to just think about money and making a career, or being a lawyer and a doctor. And I think that's an important shift that has happened. And but still, some people do get tangled up in something from previous times.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Gen X as well. I was born in 1970. I like to tell Gen Z and Gen Alpha and millennials, like, we got your back.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, we got your back. I often also think of myself as a pre-lennial because, as you said, I had this feeling that something didn't need to be the same. My dad was a very dutiful guy. He was a great dad in a lot of ways. He grew up in the Great Depression, family business. He sort of denied the things that he loved. He went into business. He studied to be an electrical engineer. He always wanted a convertible, a yellow Corvette, if I remember correctly. And he never got himself one, but he could have. But for me, like, I learned both the value of kind of working hard and applying yourself, but also doing something that you care about and hopefully love, and leaving room for enjoyment in life. So
exactly.
But nowadays, the economic reality in the future is really uncertain, right?
Yeah. Yeah. My dad was also an electrical engineer, so I find that quite fascinating. So we're on the same path and driven towards ideas about mental health too, because probably that is also something that has driven us. And there's also restlessness, I find, especially also with all generations, but with us too, where we try to define and redefine yourself throughout. And I see it as a very good thing, because we're not like, we don't see like, okay, this is my job for the next 20, 30, 50 years, and that's it. No, it's like, I'm going to do something new. I'm going to get into podcasting. I'm going to do this and so on. So that kind of curiosity that you're mentioning, I think, is hugely important for everyone to really explore that and not be stuck in just the comfort zone, really stepping out of that.
Yeah, I think some of that maybe we inherited from the 60s. The love, the openness. Even now, there's a lot more interest in psychedelic experiences and medications in psychiatry now. But it's like you want to look back over history and take what works and the wisdom and avoid the mistakes. And, there's this thing where people say like, well, I'll make different mistakes. Yeah, that's true. But I think, to bring it back to what you said about wisdom, it's kind of like, I have a feeling sometimes, which is like, could we please start doing this thing right? Because we really have so much to be grateful for. And there's so many people in need. And there's so many things we kind of squander, the planet's rich resources on. And it almost, I think, it's definitely, people tell me it's really hard to understand. Like, you'll hear people who kind of want a more open society, which is humanistic, not understand how other people can engage in activities that seem, essentially evil, on a daily basis, or, the guilt that people sometimes feel, myself included, in having sort of such bounty, when we know that, especially nowadays, so many other people don't even have enough to eat or a place to live, right? So
yeah, but I think like guilt is also often has this negative emotional charge to it. So I feel like it should like inspire, like anything that inspires us to move forward, like always towards the positive. And I see a lot of people who the guilt is kind of like is hovering over them, and they don't feel like they have the right to enjoy their lives. And so I think it's like really important to keep things in balance. And you mentioned something like give and take dynamics, which I like. Finding that balance between my personal well-being and then also helping others. And that is hugely important because a lot of people are more towards geared towards others and they suffer as a result. And in the end, everyone suffers.
Yeah, that's like one of our core messages. And I think the practice of self-compassion or mindful self-compassion, my sense is that once you become compassionate, you can't tell yourself and other people apart in a certain way. So with people who are self-sacrificing, a lot of times what I see, and guilt is one part of it, shame, disgust, self-criticism, they treat themselves with a lower ethical standard than they treat other people. Are you familiar with, you must be, the philosopher Levinas?
Actually, I'm not.
You know this? Um, well, he had this idea of like radical, speaking of positivity, like radical obligation to the other person. He says when you're confronted something like with the face of the other, then you're obligated to them in a certain way. Now that could read into being, you know, self-sacrificing, like you're saying. But in our work, we really look at the self-compassion because, as you said, you can't be there for other people if you're not there for yourself. And we learn this, like you said earlier, in our parent-child relations or our sibling relations.
And it just reminded me of Sartre, where you see like the other is defining you because they control you, the gaze of the other. And I think that kind of like enslaves us in many ways where we're not free and we don't feel free. But it's like, it's that kind of shift where we need to just kind of shift our way of thinking and realize when there's an emergency, like on a plane, you want to get the oxygen mask for yourself first and then help the others. Otherwise, you're not helping anyone. And I think that is something to keep in mind too. But again, we also see the opposite where people just become selfish and they just think about themselves. And we see a lot of people like that. And that's also, I think, because something is wrong. Something is wrong within them. This comes from a certain type of trauma or dissatisfaction, or negativity. And that if they had a choice, they would probably not act that way and realize, no, we're in this together.
Yeah. You know, I wonder, so Sartre, there's a kind of a paranoid quality about other people. And listen, this in some ways, I really don't mean this in a single way. I don't mean it in a singular way. And I don't mean it in a negative way, but in some sense, the biggest threat to a person is another person. And in some sense, it's oneself often, sadly, sometimes literally. When you talk about paranoia and you're talking about modern culture, you know, the concept of the panopticon, like the prison, like I feel like social media has become that, you know, that we can see each other all the time. And you know that you're seeing me and I'm seeing you. And you mentioned this would be on YouTube. So as we're speaking, right, imagining being watched later on YouTube, right? Who's going to be watching? And in our books, we talk about give and take as a kind of a goal is to be in a state of mutuality, and compassion for oneself and others is required for that. We have a kind of a process that toward the end of our books you get to called the dream sequence. And so this is a developmental pathway: discovery, repair, empowerment, alternatives, and mutuality. And so you realize something is wrong. What did Sartre call it? There's a philosophical term.
Mauvaise foi, I think, the like bad faith.
Bad
like
faith. Yeah. You realize something is off. And sometimes there's like a big aha for a person, but there's many like aftershocks. And that moment of self-recognition can have the good, the bad, and the unpleasant. And how do you stay with yourself through that? You know, in making a crazy work for you, it's about your relationship, your bad faith with yourself. The other books are about others.
That's it. But I think
how do you ride that out?
But I think like just being authentic, and that's something that's thrown around. And what's the definition of authentic? But I think one thing is like when you really yourself and you have nothing to hide. I mean, that's really hard to do. But once you have nothing to hide, what are you paranoid about? I mean, I think like even like on my phone, if somebody hacks my phone, I have nothing that could compromise me in any ways, and I feel fine with that because it's also like it's a reflection of who I am, and that kind of congruence between who you project and who you are. So I think that is once you have that faith, and once the two kind of combine mostly, or if it's 100%, you're really lucky, you're probably enlightened. But once you get that, then the paranoia goes away, and you say, you know what, you can criticize me, but I am feeling that this is the right thing. And if I'm doing the wrong thing, then I apologize and I should be fine and rectify it. But we don't see that. We're constantly scared, and myself too. I mean, until recently, when things would worry me, and I think, just relax, just enjoy your life and be who you are and try to do
Yeah.
the right thing, and you should be okay. Yeah.
It's funny because we can struggle with
Sorry, you just cut out here. Sorry, you
no
just
one
cut out.
knows about.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh,
We just cut out a bit.
where
Yeah.
where did we cut out?
Just the answer.
If you do have something, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
If you do have something that you're hiding that could cause problems, right? Some people have stuff that they're doing. You could get arrested or something. But in terms of, if it's just that bad feeling and there's no real reality to it, and you're hiding in some kind of shameful state, I agree with you. It's you can get to a place where you're right with yourself, and then you can be right with other people, and it does often involve the self-discovery. We talked about like the experience growing up. We use a mnemonic called grafts, which is shorthand for different patterns that come up with our caregivers in order to keep the other person happy, acting as a human antidepressant, as Dr. Borg says. That's being good, being right, being absent, staying out of the way, right? Sometimes you have to stay out of your parents' way, being funny, right? Entertaining, tense, like, walking on eggshells, or being smart, So a lot of these things are like getting good grades and being a good child, right? And so this shapes our personality. But I want to ask you something, because you're talking about positive and negative.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that are helpful can feel negative. So how do you kind of own quote unquote negativity?
Well, I don't see anything necessarily as good and bad, and I try to avoid that as much as I can, because I think part of the problem nowadays is we have really black and white thinking. And so I think seen in a different light, something that is perceived as negative can actually be quite positive, and we just might not understand it or see it that way. Or in the context, it would make more sense. And so by positivity, I basically mean that things that make us feel good and that continues with that and you spread it. But however, sometimes we need to be tough on others too. So I don't think of the idea of just positive thinking and everything is fine and deluding yourself, because everything is not fine. But we can bring a sense of positivity to it to change it without using aggression or, again, shaming others or making others feel guilty even. I think that's important. And it also goes down to the definition of open-mindedness. And people say they're open-minded, but I find the more people say that, the less open-minded they are. And it goes back to also religious people or spiritual people. It's the ones that don't say they are religious. They are probably much more religious than the others. And the others want to just kind of make a point or be in the limelight, or probably they could be also, some of them, narcissists of saying, look what a good person I am and I need your admiration. Whereas you just quietly do your good deeds and you don't expect anything in return. I mean, that to me is the very core of spirituality. Does that make sense?
The not expecting anything in return. I have so many thoughts about what you just said. The open-mindedness versus rigidity stands out for me as being really important. And I think a lot of people are very open-minded in very particular directions. And subjectively, they may actually experience themselves as being open-minded, but it's because you don't, myself included, you don't always know what you don't know.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so, hey, I'm infinitely open-minded about this one thing. Have you ever seen or heard of, the movie The Holy Mountain by Alejandro
Yeah, I've seen that.
Jodorowsky?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you ever? Well, so they're trying to attain like the peak of this mountain, and they're on this holy journey together, and most of the guys and girls and in between are on the journey are like very, very successful capitalists or politicians or warmongers.
Mhm.
Anyway, they're on this journey to get to the top of the sacred mountain, and they get sidetracked into a bar called the Pantheon Bar, which has all the different false paths to enlightenment through history all condensed into one place. This was like Jodorowsky's crazy movie. And one of the guys they meet there is this strong man, and he's wearing like this techno backpack. This was made in the early 70s. And he can teleport himself from one side of the holy mountain to the other side. And he says, I have conquered the holy mountain. And then the master says, yes, but you haven't gone to the top. You can only go through the mountain. And he says, I have conquered it horizontally. So some people, I think it's hard to know if you're really open-minded or not. And then what does it mean to kind of go off the deep end? You know, sometimes I see people where it feels like they can get so far into some form of belief or philosophical pursuit or some religion or some kind of thing. It's not so good for them. How do you draw the line?
Yeah, but it's like also seeing
And
the
you can edit out that whole holy mountain thing. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you can see it as a holistic thing too, of like just not getting bogged down in one part of it. But there's certain one type of behavior of a person that you don't like, but there's so much more that you do like about them, and there are actually decent people, but maybe one part they're misbehaving, or maybe again somebody had a bad day and they're shouting and fighting, and then the rest of the day they're actually pretty good people. But if we harbor on that one moment, I think that's the issue. And I think it's also this drive for perfection. And that is the younger generation. They really want everything to be 100% perfect. And that's deluding, and that's often not helpful, and it creates more stress for oneself as well as others, I think.
I think that's helpful. Keats, the poet, had an idea he called negative capability. And a lot of the people in my psychoanalytic tradition have sort of used this in the interpersonal relational school of psychoanalysis. And the idea is that you get some kind of negative capability, strength, or capacity comes from not trying to figure it out and get it just right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so your point about perfectionism and even the idea of authenticity, it's so polarized. It's bad to be authentic. It's good to be authentic. Like you said, it's not about good and bad, but there is a movement in the direction of something that's, say, more constructive.
Yeah.
And I think you're calling for a kind of a sanity and a kind of a basic decency also.
And also common sense. I think that's another point that is often overlooked. And it's like just using common sense in situations. And I think for myself, of finding myself, the best, easiest way, or I think pretty much probably the only way, is by finding out what I'm not. By in a negative way of getting rid of all the things that I'm not. It's like, oh, this is who I am. So kind of like when you sculpt and you like just have like piece of rock and you clay and you work your way through it, and that authentic being is somewhere inside, but it takes a lot of work and effort too, and self-discovery and so on. But it doesn't come quickly, and that's one of the issues today too. We want answers quick. We want the quick fix. Solutions need to be rapid, and that's not how it works. That's not how psychiatry works too. If you want to improve, it's not like with 1 or 2 sessions I'm done, right? And that's why I think people are driven towards medication, because they feel that that's faster, but that's also not, in many ways, not helping.
Yeah, again, so many things to think about. I think slowing down is really important, and the world seems to be accelerating in social media and quote unquote dopamine hits, and the need for constant stimulation, the attentional problems, the constant, the state of the art of advertising and entertainment is so high that, essentially we lose our own sense of choice. And I think you're right. I think you have to really slow down and be not vigilant or paranoid, but quite watchful. in order to make sense of what's happening. And so I think slowing down is a big part of making your crazy work for you. And I think listening to other people, because since we can't see ourselves very clearly, as you're saying, having someone else who you trust pretty well and being open to that feedback is important. You used the term narcissistic earlier, and that makes that problematic, because it's like you're inside of a bubble and the inside of the bubble is a mirror, and the mirror is distorted, and you're not hearing other people. You're only seeing your own kind of odd reflection.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, for me, it's also like just wearing lenses. Like I wear glasses too, and so once you wear those lenses and you correct parts of yourself and you see things in a clear light, it just becomes so much. Everything becomes clear, right, at that moment. But once you don't, it's all blurry, and so we shouldn't just be okay with the blurry vision. We should try again, finding that perfect fit. And again, trial and error. That's how we learn. And using others as mirrors. It's listening to their feedback and growing on it. Using what is helpful and what is discriminating against the stuff that is not helpful, and say, okay, I don't think this applies to me. And but it's a bit of a battle, but I think it's worthwhile of engaging in it. And one thing I love and that's what's happening with psychiatry, and we also have positive psychiatry and so on, the moving towards, we all need help. We all need mental health. And so, and we always can improve on it, and we can build on it. And I think like a lot of people, and myself was included, I was mildly depressed. I was like quite satisfied with things, but I wasn't necessarily fully happy or really enjoying things that I do. And I think we can. I think we should, and I think that's why we're here to find that and optimize and self-actualization, like Maslow would say. I think that should be our goal for those who are privileged again, where you don't have to worry about surviving. And this, I think, should be the norm, that we all strive towards that. And I think that's what you're working with clients like that too, which I find very good, because a lot of psychiatrists say, I don't have time for that. I take the serious cases, which is also fine, but we all need help in one way or another.
Yeah, I do a fair amount of individual therapy in my private practice, and I prescribe some medications, and I've treated people with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which stimulates the cortex of the brain. You're talking about the speed of change, and I thought of that at the time in terms of neuroplasticity. So the kind of development where and you can develop in a lot of different directions, but there do seem to be ways where you want to help people develop faster, right? Because while it is good to take your time, you don't necessarily want to waste your time, because we, after all, have a finite amount of time. And so some things that can modify the brain's ability to learn maybe can help us, get to wisdom faster, though that's a bit of the joke of the holy mountain, is trying to commercialize personal growth. As a psychiatrist, I very much believe in health and wellness, like positive psychiatry, as you mentioned, and not just an illness model. But I do think it's important to make a distinction between mental illness and the kind of well-being and health that in some philosophical system every human being has a right to. And there's a difference between being ill, right? Because the brain can have illnesses. I do believe there are psychiatric illnesses, but a lot of what we suffer from is not an individual illness. It's a societal problem, that gets diagnosed. Like you started with collective trauma of the pandemic. And then before that, there's traumas on a collective level at an escalating frequency. One of the things in my not-for-profit work that I do is disaster mental health. I'm on the board of Vibrant Emotional Health. I co-chair the Disaster Trauma and Global Health Committee for the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry. I'm the co-advisor of Vibrant's Crisis Emotional Care Team, and I'm one of the architects of the chronic cyclical disasters model that has been an interdisciplinary collaboration with Vibrant, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, GAP, and a healthcare informatics company in Boston called Decision Point. And we've created a dynamic, complex model of overlapping disasters. And it's meant to be a kind of a model that can really cover the bases for many disasters happening to different types of communities at different times, on top of the social determinants of health, and foundational issues like systemic racism, gender bias, so that we can think in the way you're describing about how to take care of all the different stakeholders. So, as you say, like as a psychiatrist, I forget sometimes I'm a psychiatrist. It really is an important public health goal for me. And everything I do, I realize looking back over my life, is maybe because I came from a family where people were troubled, where there's developmental disability, where my mother was sick and died when I was young, where we grew up in a very ethical culture. My family's cultural background is very much about taking care of everyone if you can, and making sure that you're safe. So I find myself, writing these books. I also have a podcast called Doorknob Comments, the chronic cyclical disaster model. We've been talking with people all over the country, and it's very well received, even by leading experts. So that's like super exciting. And then I think I mentioned when we were talking is I have a creative background. If you're watching on video, you can kind of see my office has got a lot of little stuff. There's art in the back, and I'm very much into photography. I like still photography. I take a ton of photographs myself, and have painted and stuff in the past. But I got invited to co-organize a mental health film festival with a guy named Joffrey Guerrero of Katra Film Series. He's been doing urban, BIPOC, emerging voices, Brooklyn-based film festivals for over 11 years with Katra Films. And so we founded the Urban Dreams Mental Health Film Festival, and it'll be our first one in September, fingers crossed. We've gotten over 60 submissions, including 7 feature-length films and 5 screenplays. And we're very excited to bring this kind of right. There's definitely a bias to the philosophy that you recommend for people, right? It's based in some notion of goodness.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious what your sort of philosophy of life is. Where did you land?
My philosophy of life. I mean, I'm also a creative person. I tried making a short. I made a short film, which was a lot of fun, but it was also very challenging. So I found like if I want to do that as like a full-time job, it'd be so draining, though rewarding at the same time. And I think that's also how
Making films.
making films. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I consume films. I love films, but then once you're on the other side, it's like, okay, no, this is quite hard actually putting it together and editing and the whole process.
What film did you make?
Oh, it's a short film.
Tell me about your film.
It's a short film that's actually a very like current now, but I made it like 20 something years ago about a goth person who gets beaten up and killed, and it's set in Mexico. And it's actually in Spanish. But and then there are 2 guys on the bench who just like basically commented on things, but they're sexist. They're the way they talk, they're demeaning to women, and also to those kind of people, which they call those kind of people. And so this was driven because I had heard the news something about that, and now like when you see things, it's like, oh, okay, so this was kind of like a bit visionary filmmaking, even though it's my first film and it had various flaws and so on. But I thought that was interesting. And in the twist of the film is actually the dead person comes back and talks to them. So he appears and reappears and so on. So it's quirky, it's wacky and so on. But I think that is really important to me of that kind of a sense of humor, but also a certain kind of quirkiness, thinking outside of the box. And that can be, to me, it's satisfying, but it can also be very tough at times where you just don't fit in one box. And you might try, but and I say, like, you know what, the box needs to come to me. I just be myself, and then maybe you'll create. And that's why it's Arash's world, because it's my experiences and my learning experiences throughout life as a blog as well as the podcast. And I talk to experts like yourself to kind of explore that and dive deeper into and learn from it too, and adjust my path, right? But I think the journey is really trying to find myself, and I think I've never been this close. Or maybe I was this close when I was in elementary school and something happened and I just kind of lost about 30 something years there, but
Yeah.
I'm going back to that, and I find it very satisfying.
You can kind of rediscover yourself. I mean, I
Yeah,
also was bullied as a kid, and the
yeah,
feeling of not belonging, I was like, we used to always, I was always told I was kind of weird, and I did some stuff that was weird, but never creepy. I don't believe. And I think the root of the word weird, it means kind of like magical, right? Like a weird is a
yeah,
spell. Like
yeah,
the word,
yeah,
I think the word weird is related to the word word.
yeah.
And a word is like a way to make something come into being, right? When you name something, it can become real, but you can also use words to create falsehoods, right?
Mhm.
And there's something very interesting about that, in terms of kind of not fitting in. For sure, I prefer to be in lots of different places. Giftedness is defined by the personality trait of openness to new experience. It's one of the only personality traits that seems to account for what people call gifted. And maybe you can kind of cultivate that, but again, it's tricky. But I think more people probably feel like they don't know where they fit in. And a lot of people try to fit in because you're supposed to try to fit in,
Yeah.
and it's good to be able to fit in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, it was like also culturally. I grew up in Germany, so and I was born in Iran. So it was like there's this like when people talk about racism, yes, I experienced it, and some of those racist people were actually I became friends with them, and they would say, you know what, you're different. We don't mean you when we complain about them, and it's like, but that's those are my family members you'll see in the street, and you so it's like but you realize that there's another side to it too, and I didn't try to fit, I didn't try to please them, of course, but I saw some good sides in them as well. So it really changed my perspective because I have no place that's home, so everywhere is your home wherever you go, and it's like it's that rootlessness is it's also very troubling, but at the same time it's very liberating. And I think of the Bob Dylan song. It's like like a Rolling Stone, and that's really how my life has
Yeah.
been. And I don't see it as a bad thing anymore, what I used to. And I don't often understand when people try to fit in. I was like, you don't have to. You can. It's good if you are, but if you're not, that's fine too.
Yeah. Well, earlier when you were talking about Gen X,
Yeah.
I thought of On the Road, like the
Oh yeah,
Dharma
yeah. Of
Bums
course.
and Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
But the thing is, in order to work in a team, and this goes back to your question about the workplace, and
Mhm.
one of the hats I wear is as medical director for New York State for Soul Mental Health, which I had founded a company in New York that provided in-network psychiatry and psychotherapy as one of the co-founders, and Soul Mental Health took
Mhm.
on that company, and it's a national mental health um, practice now, and I'm the medical director in New York. I've learned so much from working in a more structured setting. The last time I did that was really I was a surgical resident for 2 years before I went into psychiatry, and surgical training is highly regimented, almost military. And larger companies also have to work with a high degree of coordination. And when you can do good things in coordination with a team that has multiple skill sets that are highly specialized, then you can really accomplish great things, which are much harder to do, on one zone. So it's like sports. I'm not into field sports, but I do like athletics and certain types of sports, martial arts and yoga and stuff. But the ability to coordinate together requires a kind of a conformity. And that can be really, really bad because that power can be used to do bad to people or, harm people, right? So, I think the question of belonging and being able to work on a team is just a really tricky one, but it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's definitely not my, I think, natural predisposition, though some of that may come from my family background, right? Because in my family, after this terrible death happened of my mother, we kind of held together, but in a lot of ways we didn't. In a lot of ways, it was everyone sort of on their own. Um, and so that's also part of what becomes your own sense of self, right? And you have to, as you said earlier, you look back on with some perspective on your you look back with some perspective on your own childhood, and you start to see sort of different parts. And if you hold that with compassion,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can be non-judgmental, and you can start to see the sort of the healing and the growth potential. Sometimes it's called post-traumatic growth,
Yeah. Yeah.
out
Exactly.
of which comes wisdom and meaning and integration and
But that
acceptance.
flexibility is really important too when you're engaging with team members to be flexible yourself. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. But I mean, for me, 12 Angry Men, we talk about movies. 12 Angry Men to me, like that's just wonderful. Where it's like one man standing up and say, wait a minute, let's talk about this and going against the norm. And I see myself as sometimes that person, even though it's like people will not like it, it feels uncomfortable. But you want to be the one that you're doing the right thing. And I think that's important too. At the same time, you do want to work with the team. You do want to listen to them and so on. So that's again flexibility to be open to that and not just shutting off. And so that's how I perceive it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a traumatologist at the University of Oregon named Jennifer Freyd, F-R-E-Y-D, and she, among other things, has founded the Center for Institutional Courage, which studies things like institutional gaslighting, DARVO, defend and reverse victim and oppressor, talks about betrayal trauma. And I agree with you 100%. Like, you have to find your voice, but you also have to be in a social place where people will listen.
Yeah.
And I had some association, I have to say, to Thus Spake Zarathustra, to Nietzsche, when,
Oh, yeah.
you want to be that voice,
Yeah.
even if you're not always popular. And I think, it's pretty obvious that a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to win the popularity contest.
Yeah.
And that often is a bad decision ethically.
Mhm.
It puts you in ethical hot water to be popular. But, the best thing would be if these sort of, you and I seem to agree on these values, right? If it were popular to have humanistic, communal, tolerant values, if we could all agree on what the goal was.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
right, we know the problem is not everyone's on the same page yet.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Grant Brenner. Your book is Making Your Crazy Work for You, From Trauma and Isolation to Self-Acceptance and Love. It's been just so fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's been a huge pleasure, and I hope listeners enjoy it and get something out of it. Thanks for having me here, Raj.
Wonderful.